Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of what is still the Cognitive Dissidence Podcast, but which will become the Jacob Shapiro Podcast next week. You don't have to do anything, but it's going to happen. Don't be afraid when it changes in your podcast feed. Joining me on the podcast today is Shane McLorrain. I was trying to have Shane on last week, and my schedule got a little bit nuts. Shane is a Paris-based analyst. He is managing editor and podcast host at Tocqueville 21. He's also a research analyst at the Center for Critical Democracy Studies. We've kept in touch for a little while, but it was nice to finally put a face to a name and get to record this podcast with him. Some really interesting insights about what's going on in France and what that might mean or might not mean for the European Union and French politics going forward in general. A little bit of a different take than Rob has had on France, which makes sense, somebody who has been there longer than Rob. So interesting to juxtapose what Rob has experienced in France so far with what Shane did. Shane, thank you for coming on the podcast. Listeners, this is the part where I tell if you want to chat some more, email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Also, we continue to grow the podcast pretty impressively. If you have not left us a review before, please, or a rating, please consider doing so. It takes just a couple seconds, really helps us with our algorithm and everything else. Otherwise, take good care of each other. I hope if you are living in a part of the world where it's summer, that you're having a good summer. Cheers and see you out there. Shane, thank you for, well, it's not early for you, it's early for me, and I kept you waiting because I was late and my alarm didn't go off. If you're finding me on YouTube, that's why what's left of my hair looks like this. It's good to see you, Shane.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
I have to tell you, I'm a little intimidated, because this is the first time we're meeting, and we got on, and you said hello, and we started talking, and I was like, wow, I have met someone whose podcast voice might just be deeper and more resonant than mine. So to the listeners, you're welcome. If you're having trouble sleeping, I think this is going to be a good one to listen to. Not because the content is boring, but you've got two very deep bass voices. Shane,
right. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, yes, you do. Stop it. This false humility. He was saying this before we got on, too, listeners. But so the reason I reached out to you was you are based in Paris, and Rob is also based in Paris, but Rob is an American. You, it turns out, are both an American and a Frenchman, although you've been in France since you were 13, so maybe you're more French than American. I don't know. That's probably a pretty strange line to straddle. We can talk about that later, maybe towards the end of the podcast. But the way to set this up for listeners is, unless you've been living under a rock, French President Emmanuel Macron declared French elections after a disappointing performance in European parliamentary elections. It's a pretty high stakes gamble, and the polls, at least to the extent that we can trust them, don't look like they're doing very well for him. So the far right and its allies have climbed as of this recording. It's Tuesday, June 25th. We're going to get this out in the next couple of days, but the polls that I have from Le Figaro says far rights and allies climbed up to 36%. The left-wing alliance, New Popular Front, up to 29.5%. And Macron and his centrist camp down to 20.5%, which that means basically nobody gets a majority. We might be looking towards a hung parliament where there is no majority in the assembly. And I don't really know of any precedent for that in recent French politics. Macron has also said no matter what happens in the elections, he's not going anywhere. He is going to remain president. And I guess you can do that because the executive is strong in France, and maybe he wants to give the far right enough rope to hang themselves with their crazy policies. But it certainly is a high stakes gamble. And I've said, I don't think I've said it on the podcast, but I've said to some clients and also on the road recently, if I'm Zelensky, I'm way more worried about the results of this election than I am about the ones in November, because Europe matters way more to Ukraine's future than the United States. But anyway, that's sort of setting the scene. Shane, you said it's chaos in Paris. Tell us, at least tell us what you're experiencing right now so far.
All right. Well, before I get into that, I sort of have to set the stage and just make sure that listeners are aware of the 5 groups that dominate the political spectrum and that are dominating this election. So from right to left, at the far right, you have the Rassemblement National, the National Rally, which is led by Marine Le Pen and her protege, Jordan Bardella. He's the one who's potentially going for the premiership for the upcoming elections. So Jacob already said that they're polling at around 36%. It's up and down between 30 and 40%, essentially. The most recent numbers I saw were 33. Immediately to their right, you have the traditional conservative party, the Republicans. So they're the establishment party. They've been in power for a majority of the time since the establishment of the Fifth Republic in 1958. They were the party of de Gaulle, and they are currently split into two factions. One is led by the official party leader, Éric Ciotti, and is running as an ally of the Rassemblement National. It is, by all accounts, a splinter party and has been repudiated by a majority of the rest of the leadership. The other faction is running somewhat more independently, although there are talks of alliance with Modem, which is one of Macron's coalition members. The other party, yes, so it's running independently. It's led by François-Xavier Bellamy and a number of other leaders. François-Xavier Bellamy being the head of the list that ran in the European elections, and they're polling collectively under 10%. But again, it depends on the poll. A lot of this is just very much in flux. So to their left and in the center, you have Macron's presidential majority, led by Prime Minister Gabriel Attal. They're polling at around 20%. And then on the actual left, you have the Nouveau Front Populaire, which is an alliance of left-wing parties going from the moderate, establishment-ish socialist party to the much more hard left La France Insoumise, run by a guy called Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And we'll undoubtedly be coming back to him later. So together, they're expected to capture anywhere between 20 and 30% of the vote, depending on the polls. So they are polling above Macron and below the Rassemblement National. So now that we've sort of set that up, the first thing that it is important to remember about French politics is that it is soap operatic. And that has been incredibly exaggerated by the short nature of the campaign. When Macron announced the dissolution of the Assembly and scheduled the elections for less than a month after the European elections, it threw everyone into disarray. It caught everyone off guard, including his own party. There's a lot of animosity, actually, that seems to have built up against him. So it appears that his plan was this chaos. The idea was that the Rassemblement National, for reasons that are both structural and circumstantial, would not perform as well in the European elections or rather would not perform as well in the legislative elections as it had in the European elections, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it seemed comparatively unlikely that the left would form any kind of coalition simply because they tried that 2 years ago. It ended badly. And the left is notoriously, I think the word that's going around is sectarian. There's a lot of infighting. The thing is, he seems to have been mostly right about the Rassemblement National. We'll see. Nothing we can say for sure there. And somewhat correct about the left. I suspect the big issue is that he severely underestimated the degree to which people hate him.
And I wanted to talk about that. So why do you think it is that they do hate him? I mean, he is kind of, at least from an American's point of view, he can be kind of cold. He's sort of not good at the natural performative parts of politics, even smug and condescending, if you want to push it a little bit further. He reminds me, I mean, there are some major differences, but he reminds me slightly of Barack Obama in the sense that he promised to be, he was the revolutionary firebrand when he first came on the scene. He was the one who upended everything. And he really has turned out to be more of a mainstream reformer, hasn't sort of been the revolutionary figure that he talked about. So there's this level of hypocrisy there too. But on the other side, I mean, France has done better than most of the EU on a relative basis in terms of jobs growth, in terms of inflation. I mean, that's not really because of Macron, that's because of energy policy going back decades, but still, like, it's been better. France is now getting in trouble with the EU because they've used the budget deficit to cushion, rising prices. Certainly, immigration and crime are a problem, but they're statistically lower than they have been in some previous decades. So, I mean, you sort of put it together. I mean, maybe I've said this about Chile, like people do a little bit better and they're like, but I want to do even better than that. And the president becomes sort of a lightning rod for discontent. But how do you explain um, his utter unpopularity with the French people? And maybe it's just because he's been around too long. I don't know. But how do you explain it?
Okay, well, two things there. First, just a point of order. If I remember correctly, the statement made by the European Commission was sort of the timing was terrible, admittedly, but this isn't anything that was unexpected. It was something that was scheduled. That was scheduled. The fact that it happened during an election had more to do with the fact that the elections themselves were unscheduled. The timing is absolutely terrible because all of the parties, with the exception of perhaps Les Républicains, are running on a platform that is focused on increasing spending and that economists have criticized as completely detached from fiscal reality. But that's baked into the cake. That sort of thing, that sort of confrontation with the European Union, like Italy was also called out, and there are and you've got Giorgia Meloni, who's currently very much in favor at the European level. This is just a natural part of how the European Union functions. Macron, I like the Barack Obama comparison. There's a lot of that revolutionary nature to him. But I think part of the issue with Macron is that he's actually much weirder than one would assume looking at him from the United States.
Yeah.
So he is, by all accounts, like he's a socialist. He was originally from the Socialist Party. He came up through the Socialist Party, but who ran on a centrist, somewhat progressive, pro-business platform that aimed to sort of make France much more competitive internationally. And in doing so, he had to take aim at a lot of the calcified entitlement programs, a lot of the welfare, a lot of the like the big one in particular was the word for it is retirement. There we go. He took aim at retirement. He took aim at a lot of these programs that were aimed at workers, etc., in order to make France more competitive. And I say calcified for a reason. These are things that have sort of built up since the Mitterrand presidency, so in the 1980s. There hasn't been a lot of entitlement reform. There hasn't been any sort of réforme des retraites. There's been a lot of discussion about like how stultified labor law in France is, but there hasn't, nothing has really been done about that. And so France over the course of the past 30 years, or in the 20 years leading up to Macron, became less and less competitive from a business perspective, or rather from an international perspective for a long time. And this sort of really got out of hand during the Eurozone crisis. So when I was in college, France had, when I was in college and when I was coming out of college, France had, 25% youth unemployment. Overall unemployment was 10%. And this persisted for years. And obviously there were reasons beyond just, the French president for that. I mean, the relationship between Germany and the European Union, or rather France, Germany, and the European Union really played into all of that. But France has been has had a habit of being an uncompetitive business environment for a very long time, and Macron sort of rose up as a figure aiming to change that. The problem is he brought a lot of the other baggage that comes with pro-business candidates. So you say Barack Obama, I say Mitt Romney. there were no dogs on car roofs, but during his first electoral campaign, there were a few mistakes that he made, little comments, les petites phrases de Macron, we say, Macron's little phrases, that felt very condescending towards working people, completely detached from the realities of the working classes. And those really stuck with him because they constituted this idea of a president of the elite, of a president of the rich. And so it doesn't matter to some degree, or rather, the gains that he made were not sufficient enough to counter that, especially coupled with his leadership style, which is, yes, arrogant, elitist, detached, jupitarien, so removed and aloof. So it's partially a PR problem. The other is, of course, that he hasn't managed to accomplish anywhere near what he promised. Though, funnily enough, that is at least partially because of the, how do I put this? Truly astounding backlash he has faced at literally every conceivable turn. Now, again, this is at least partially because people don't think he had their best interests at heart from the start, but Macron's presidential campaign, rather Macron's presidency, started on a relatively high note, and within 2 years, he was embroiled in a crisis, the Gilets jaunes. This was because of an environmentalist hike to gas prices, fuel prices, yes. And it was something relatively meager. It was like 0.5%, 2%, I can't remember. But that lasted well into COVID. There were still demonstrations for that in 2021, 2022 during the president. Like that was still a talking point in the 2022 presidential campaign. And that kind of backlash, likewise, the réforme de retraite, the retirement reform, he faced consistent opposition on that over the course of multiple years. He had to water down his overall program considerably in order to get it through the assembly. And even then, a lot of the time he's had to brute force what he's been doing. So the impact that he has had has been much less than what he promised. And it has caused an incredible amount of upset. The French are very attached to their entitlement programs. They're very attached to their social welfare state, and with good reason. But part of the issue is that these are like some of these, employment law in particular, are some of the things that have made France so uncompetitive for so long. And because Macron wanted to take aim at that, he had, he was going to end up facing an incredible amount of pushback, and he just did not have the PR acumen to handle that properly. I think I got lost in that answer somewhere, but
no,
I trust you to bring me back on point.
Of course. That's why we have guests on. We like to get lost in their brains. Well, that all makes sense. That I think we have a very good answer now for why he's unlikable. The next question is to ask you what you think Macron was thinking then, because for all of his faults, he's always seemed like a very skilled tactician and politician to me. But at least, we've got a couple weeks to go here in the stretch run. But I mean, it looks to me like it's going to be a disaster. It looks like nobody's going to have a majority, that you're going to have a French government that can't really do any things. Maybe it's going to ping pong back and forth between far right and far left parties. I'm not even really sure what a caretaker government really looks like. I was reading some stuff online about how, well, they can't really do much. You can't really propose legislation, and you can't really govern by decree. So maybe Macron can issue circulars to civil servants, and he'll have some power over defense and fiscal policy just to keep the lights on. But that, generally speaking, like, we're looking at, sort of French paralysis in a way that we haven't had for decades, honestly. So, I mean, you could take that question if you want, but I wonder what you think Macron was thinking. What do you think he thought he was going to get out of this political move?
All right. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt and imagine things would unfold in exactly the way that he had hoped. I think his hope, again, was that I mentioned earlier that the far right had structural reasons, or rather, there were structural reasons for him to assume that the far right would not do as well in a national level election. Part of it is due to its electorate. So it's disproportionately working class and disproportionately, at this point, actually, it's picking up a fair amount of the youth vote as well. And these are two groups that just don't vote nearly as much. And the second thing is the European elections have a tendency of becoming protest votes. They disproportionately attract people on the extremes. National level elections tend to see far right parties and far left parties, for that matter, do less well. So I think his assumption was, one, anything that would contribute to the perception that the Rassemblement National was not ascendant and inevitable would be incredibly important. It's very important to cut their momentum in the lead up to 2027, the next presidential election. So I think his thought was that by juxtaposing elections, by placing them, rather, by having another election in the immediate aftermath of an election where they did so well, that would create panic about the possibility of them getting through, but no real risk for these structural reasons that have been mentioned. On the other end, he just didn't think, or rather, my assumption is that he didn't think the left could get its act together. And that's a fair assumption. They did. Within 4 days of the announcement of the new elections, they managed to cobble together a coalition, much in the same vein of the previous one, sort of, although a little bit more egalitarian. But I suppose I'll get into the makeup of that coalition a little bit later. But yes, he assumed that they wouldn't be able to get their act together, and as a result, he would be running as the shield against the chaos of the far right. But he underestimated, in my opinion, his own, or rather, the willingness of the French population to go along with him. The truth is that they've simply, a lot of them have simply had it with him. But yes, no, the gambit was that. Create chaos, expect the right to underperform, expect the left to not pull itself together, which means that people, by definition, for the sake of this, the Republican wall, block the far right from power, as France has traditionally done, and then move forward with a clarified sense of purpose, move forward potentially with an absolute majority. Although I can't say for certain that, that strikes me as moderately delusional. But of course, it was a gambit. So the other, I think he also accounted for the possibility that the Rassemblement National would win a fair amount of support, and then might end up taking the premiership. In which case, good. It's a matter of giving them enough rope for them to hang themselves. Of course, they've avoided that trap by saying that they will not govern necessarily. Rather, they will not govern unless they have a. Sorry, I have to take a step back there. When it comes to enough rope to hang themselves, what I mean is that they would get a relative majority, but not an absolute majority, which means they would be governing in coalition with someone else who would have the power to sort of put a brake on their insanity. What's more, I think France has a long and storied tradition of hating the people who rule them. It is entirely likely that a protest party like the Rassemblement National, which has actually functionally no government experience whatsoever, would be unable to satisfy people any more than the socialists or the Republicans or Macron's party. In that case, we would enter 2027. Macron himself is not capable of running, so we would enter 2027 with a weakened far right, and the possibility for a return to centrist rule. I think that was the gambit that he thought he was making.
Is there a centrist figure in the wings that can take over for him, either in 27 or if he decided to step down now? Or is the picture here one of real, as you say, polarization? because I mean the thing you said about being the shield against Le Penism, that makes sense, and that's worked for Macron many times. But if the issue is that we have people are being attracted to the far right and to the far left, and that your absolute majority is in association with the fringes, and there's not enough room in the center to counterbalance both of those sides. I mean that election math is really hard, and it's probably not going to get any better. So, is there an heir apparent? Is there somebody who can put this back together, or is this kind of where France is going to be for the next couple of years, you think?
There's definitely an heir apparent. The heir apparent, well, for Macron at least, is Gabriel Attal. I called French politics soap operatic. You can't have a soap opera without a ton of characters, and there are certainly people who are in place. Certainly people who are in place who have the means to sort of cobble together a centrist coalition. So when it comes to direct, in the direct lineage of Macron, you've got Attal, so he's prime minister. This strikes me and he was like, my first thought when he was elevated to the premiership was that this was in order to prepare him to run for the presidency in 2027. And he's already proven himself in a lot of different ways. He's worked his way. He's been with Macron since the beginning. He's been with Macron since 2016. He was but a wee lad when he took on the role of, porte-parole du gouvernement, so like the spokesperson of the government. He worked his way up through several ministries, and now he's the youngest prime minister ever, but he has nonetheless had a fair amount of experience within this ruling coalition. And he's, a young and charismatic figure. Before he was elevated to the premiership, he was, in fact, the most popular politician in France. So there's definitely something there for the future. In terms of more established figures, there are certainly a few. Raphael Glucksmann, who was the party leader the head of the electoral list for the European elections for the socialists, he seems to be doing a fair amount. Let's see, you've got a few people in the Republicans. I think François-Xavier Bellamy certainly has ambitions. Oh God, I forget his first name.
Well, you've already mentioned more centrist figures that are in U.S. politics, so I think the answer to the question is yes, there are alternatives, yes. Which is maybe the sort of silver lining in all of this. Which then brings me to sort of my next question, which is Macron. He went on a podcast called Generation Do It Yourself, which, like, Emmanuel, if you're going on small time podcasts, like, let me put out the invitation to you right here. We would love to have you. But on that podcast. And I didn't mean to diss Generation Do It Yourself. I'm sure you guys are very good, but you don't have enough followers to intimidate me. I feel like we're sort of on the same level. But so apparently on that podcast, Macron said that the way that the far right is doing things, and I'm going to quote him here, quote, reduces people to their religion or their origin and pushes people towards civil war. And then he also, speaking about the far left and speaking about Mélenchon, he said that the sort of far left's form of electioneering, quote, also promotes civil war because it, again, reduces people to their religious or ethnic group. So he's now, in his desperation, maybe banging the drum and saying, hey, if you go for the far right and the far left, France is opening the doors to civil war. I want to take him seriously a little bit because I obviously think he's campaigning there. Do you have a feeling that France is hurtling towards a civil war right now? Do you think that's just, is there something in what he's saying? Or is it just, hey, the population doesn't like you, Emmanuel, and when you step back, probably French politics will revert to the way they were before?
Do I think there's a likelihood of civil war in France? Absolutely not. I'm not 100% certain, and feel free to take this with a grain of salt. France remains less polarized, all things considered, than does the United States. So Macron's statement, again, it sort of speaks to the idea that he's banking on the chaos in order to succeed. It is true that the overall population has shifted towards the polls, particularly towards the far right. But like it's also true, rather, in fact, it would be unfair to say otherwise. It is also true to say that the Rassemblement National is not the same party as the Front National was in 2002. Marine Le Pen spent years trying to clear the image of the Rassemblement National, to disassociate it from the party of her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, which was, type de Vichy, which was much more openly anti-Semitic, which really was very much an extremist party with much more of a fringe appeal, but also a much harder edge, and become a sort of catch-all populist, nationalist, Eurosceptic protest party, a party that did its best to catch the working class vote as the socialists became more and more politically mainstream, as they became much more business oriented, as they let people like Macron into the party. So, yes, the far right is larger than it has ever been, but it's not the same. It's not the same far right as it used to be. That being said, they are saying things, and a lot of their program, such as it is, and assuming it doesn't change, which it already has multiple times, a lot of their program kind of goes against, it's overtly anti-constitutional. Like one of the big things that we're talking about right now is the treatment of dual citizens, whether or not there's an ability to keep them out of sensitive positions, etc. The possibility of stripping dual citizens of their citizenship has come up. Although, again, in all honesty, other parties have done it. It's just, they've been much quieter about it. As for the Rassemblement National, it's much more of a point of pride. So there is some element of truth to what Macron is saying, but it can't be overstated either.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, if they come after dual citizenship, I imagine that you'll be facing some difficult questions yourself, eh? As he crumples. Let's zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to close here, and this might take us the rest of the time. But so we've been talking about the inside baseball or I guess I should say the inside soccer. They probably don't have baseball. The inside soccer of French politics for half an hour now, and I think we have to step back a little bit and say, okay, and what does all this mean at the European level? So, I mean, Macron has been the one pushing for EU centralization. He's been pushing for more EU sovereignty. He's been pushing the EU to be more muscular against Russia and to have more of a defense capability. He's the one warning that the EU can't depend on the United States, and we might have an election in November that will prove Macron very prescient there. Maybe that will give some new air under his wings. Tell me, sort of from your perspective, and maybe the French don't care about this. Maybe they're just fed up and they're totally sort of self-absorbed. Americans are certainly that way with their elections right now. But what do you think this means for Europe in general? Is Europe losing its biggest sort of centralizing force at the center? If Macron really is dealing with a hung parliament, are we dealing with a France that is not going to be able to follow through on commitments that they've made to Ukraine and push Germany in the direction that they wanted to push Germany? I'm just curious how you see this affecting sort of things beyond France.
I don't think this is going to okay. Well, for one, until we know the results of this election, we cannot necessarily know what the impact for Europe will be. Having said that, either way, unless Macron steps down, I think the impact on Europe as a whole will be pretty minimal. The president retains a fair amount of independence when it comes to foreign policy, as he does in the United States. There are, obviously it'll be harder to get things through, and Macron will, assuming he loses his majority here, he will be essentially a lame duck president. But the ship will stay the course. There will be no, there will be no wild veering towards a different foreign policy from France over the next 3 years, unless Macron steps down, which he has said he will not do. as for Europe on the whole, I think it's important to go back to the results of the European election. There were major upsets in France and Germany, who both went far right. And there was a major upset, or rather, sorry, there was a consolidation in Italy, where the far right expanded its lead. But on the whole, like the constitution or the distribution of the European Parliament didn't actually change all that much. I mean, the biggest losers, if I remember correctly, are the Greens, and the biggest winners, or the dominant party in the European elections, was the center right. Europe has traditionally been Europe has traditionally been led by a coalition of the center right and the center left, and Macron's party was sort of sandwiched in between. But like, so long as that coalition holds, so long as that coalition has the majority of the holds the majority of the electorate and has the majority of votes in parliament, there shouldn't be too much of a change. There were two real risks, or rather, there was one real risk, and then I have another statement to make about the same issue. The real risk was that the far right would grow enough that there would be a possibility of a coalition on the right. And that was actually the fear that was discussed most in the media when it came to the European elections. But this also was, I don't want to say ridiculous, overstated. There we go. It was overstated. Because there are multiple far rights, they're just as sectarian as the French left. They really don't associate with one another in the same way. In fact, like AFD, I can't remember if it was weeks or days before the European election, so Germany's far right was expelled from what was it, Identity and Democracy? So one of the far right parties that was led by Marine Le Pen. Giorgia Meloni's ECR doesn't want to associate with Le Pen's ID. She thinks it's too extreme. And then there's the fact that like the center right, the EPP, does not share like the priorities of the European far right at all. And even then, the two far rights do not share the same priorities. One is much more Eurosceptic than the other. One is Europhobic, the other is Eurosceptic, and then the center right is much more in line with the overall vision of the European Union, which at this point in time is pointing towards more integration and more solidification. So, like, the truth is, it's not necessarily the elections that are driving European policy at this particular point in time. It's external events. And since 2022, since the invasion of Ukraine, there's been a real realization of the position of the European Union, which has kind of led me to believe that while we have seen an increase in the far right, or a relative increase in the far right, a marginal increase in the far right, since 2019, I think the far right was much more prominent in 2022, and we're actually heading back in the opposite direction now. I think they peaked already. So, short of having the presidency in France, which would cause real issues, I don't see how this election, or rather, short of Macron stepping down, I just don't see how this situation in France could stem that momentum.
Are you worried about? I mean, we talked a little bit about the French deficit spending, and you're absolutely right. I didn't mean to make it sound like the EU was going after France meaningfully yet, but let's say you did have some kind of scenario where Macron wasn't calling the shots, and either the far right or the far left was calling the shots, and suddenly you had a major increase in French spending and things like that. I mean, folks in the finance world are worried about this creating the next euro crisis. Like, what if the risk premium on French bonds soars? What if French equities tank? I mean, on a completely unrelated sort of level, I saw Airbus was down 11-12% today. If you can't be doing well when Boeing is doing what it's doing, man, you really are struggling in general. But that's sort of an aside. Like, do you have any concerns at that level that this might set off kind of a chain reaction of events that could lead to that kind of crisis? Or again, do you think that maybe Macron is not the shield that guards from the center right, or excuse me, from the far right or the far left, but maybe he is the shield that prevents the crisis or the chaos from coming till at least 27, or at least till France can call presidential elections? Does that keep you up at night at all, or also like, nah, like Macron will be the president, so we can't say that too much is going to happen during that time?
Well, that's certainly more of a risk, I'd say. Now, how do I put this? I'm not necessarily a finance guy, so far be it from me to signal any degree of disdain. But like, if we're talking about Airbus and Boeing, yes, Airbus is down, but Boeing isn't. And that speaks already to a degree of delusion about, like the overall situation. Like we've got astronauts that are trapped in space as a direct result of the failings of Boeing. They've been going through a complete meltdown over the course of the past, 6 months, longer? And that is not necessarily reflected in the overall estimation of where they're going to be, from a stock perspective. So I wouldn't put too much faith in markets' ability to, predict the financial future of the European Union.
There's a socialist at the core of every Frenchman, I could tell. Anyway, go on.
No, but like, admittedly, yes, I can definitely see a situation wherein the European or wherein France is set against the European Union from a budget perspective. But like, again, that's something that will be dealt with post-election, because for the time being, France is set against France when it comes to like finances. The issue of the financial non-viability of the program of both the far right and the coalition left is a major talking point in these elections. But one of the things that's also said in those talking points is that, oh, well, the center didn't manage to do things correctly either. So, but again, on the other hand, there are any sorts of means, like, how likely is it? Well, you'll have to tell me. I don't think it's particularly likely that France will end up in the in a similar situation as say Greece did. For one, I think the Germans, or rather the European policy on the whole, has become much more flexible than it was post 2008, when everything was run by the Germans. There is generally, like, broadly speaking, there has been a movement towards spending more money, and this is true in the United States, and this is true in the composite parties of the composite countries of the European Union. I can't imagine it won't be true at the European level at some point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated question. It seems to me that France is doing its best to clutch defeat from the jaws of victory, because France is in a very interesting position. Germany made a long-term bet on cheap energy from Russia, and that's not a bet that France has to make. So ironically, if you could pass some of Macron's reforms, and if you could have a more pro-business environment, and you've got a Germany that is not as strong and is probably weaker sort of on an economic level than it's been in a generation, there's sort of a major opportunity for France to push forward. And yet, at its moment of of pushing on the opportunity, France is squabbling with itself, which is just sort of it's really perfect for how France normally does. But I'm pulling up here. I'm trying to pull up the latest Eurobarometer, because the last thing I wanted to ask you about is about Euroscepticism in France too, because you're absolutely right, I think, to bring up Italy and Meloni, because she has reformed the far right. She's not, yes, she's Eurosceptic technically, but she's not talking about taking Italy out of the European Union. She has no love for Putin and for Russia. Le Pen has that skeleton in her closet, because she, in the past, has said nice things about Russia and been chummy with Russia. I think that's one of the reasons people are so afraid of her. But generally speaking, when you survey all the different countries in the European Union, you get more Euroscepticism in France than almost any other country. And so I guess the last thing that I'll just ask you is, do you feel that Euroscepticism in your own life? Do you see it in the polling yourself? Do you think that France itself is doubting its future relationship with the EU? Or is that also making a mountain out of a molehill?
France isn't doubting its relationship with the European Union. France is resenting its relationship with the European Union. But like, that too is normal. Like, France views itself as a great power. One. Two, it is the prerogative of all great powers to be completely delusional about their position in global affairs, or completely ignorant of the overall position. Like, generally speaking, the more power a country has, or this is what I've noticed in a lot of the conversations I've had with members of my audience, in other domains. But like the smaller a country, the more likely they are to be aware of the position that their country occupies in international relations, and to be cognizant of the risks and opportunities afforded by that position. The larger and more powerful a country is, the more it becomes just a rah, my country is great or, is awful, depending on the side of the political spectrum you're talking about. The more likely that is to be the general perspective. So, there is a degree of resentment because, France has traditionally viewed itself as somewhat apart. It's viewed itself as a global power. And in fact, there's a good reason, to view this as true. It's one of the only European countries with projection power. It has one of the largest navies in the world. It's one of the world's largest economies. It's energy independent. It did not make the same mistake as Germany in tying itself so tightly to Russia. And there's also the example. Of what's going on with the UK, a country that actually did exit the European Union and is very much paying the price for it. It suffered years of absolute chaos as a direct result of this vote. So to go back more specifically to France, I do have to restate the fact that 2022 really did change everything. There was a degree of a strong Eurosceptic edge in 2022 in the presidential elections, but after the invasion of Ukraine, like even Le Pen had to backpedal wildly. Even in the Rassemblement National, there aren't a ton of people who you will hear talking about an actual exit from the European Union, a Frexit. I think like that matter or that risk is not particularly active at this point in time.
Yeah, I hear you, but so I'm thumbing through the Eurobarometer, which I showed them before we got on the podcast. But at first, it wouldn't surprise you that France as a country was the most skeptical of the European Parliament. But hell, I'm skeptical of the European Parliament. But here's a survey that maybe sort of underlines exactly what we're talking about, and is a good way to close out. So the question is, at the present time, would you say that in general things are going in the right direction or in the wrong direction in your country? And the answer for this question, France leads the pack. 76% of French people say something is going wrong. 5% are sort of in the middle, and only 11% say things are going well. And to put that into perspective, there are only 2 countries here that have a majority things are going in the right direction. Do you care to guess which countries those are? Very interesting. They're Ireland and Luxembourg. Everybody else is majority not going in the right direction. Denmark and Poland are both almost there at that sort of 50% mark. But most of those others, it's much more even. Sort of, forgive the terrible pun, but on the far right of this chart, I mean, you've got France hanging out with Greece and Bulgaria and Slovakia, which just had a leader that was almost assassinated. Portugal, not good company to be in here. So no matter what we think about France in general, the people don't seem to be happy with where things are going.
Sure. Yes. But to be fair, again, to come back to that point, the French detest leadership. Like, I was talking earlier about how unpopular Macron is. He's the first president in 20 years to be reelected. He's got a 29% approval rating currently. That's still much better than his predecessor had at the time of the end of his term. Like, and again, I can't overstate this. This is a real difference with American politics. Like, an American president has a 35% approval rating, and the sky is absolutely falling. In order to get that, you have to have real domestic challenges. France, I think the last few leaders have sort of hung out in the 30s for a majority of their presidency. Hollande, when he left the presidency in 2017, left with a 17% approval rating. Sarkozy wasn't. I think he was much higher than that, but nonetheless, he wasn't all that high. Again, Macron, he's many things, but he did win re-election after sort of years of trade-off, and that's no mean feat.
No, it's no mean feat at all, and I take your point. And the French. I've been reading about the French Revolution in general. They certainly don't like their leaders, but if they don't like their own leadership, certainly they like the European Union even less. Because so again, this is the Eurobarometer for the first quarter of this year. At the present time, would you say in general that things are going in the right direction or the wrong direction for the European Union? And there, the wrong direction. France says 65% the wrong direction and 15% the right direction. And again, to put that into some perspective there, um, the next ones that have a similar level of skepticism about Europe are Slovakia, Finland, Estonia, Germany, and they're all hanging out around 30% approval. So that's double what France's approval rating is for the European Union. And maybe that's the thing that everybody's worried about, and what markets are worried about in general and are sniffing out. They're sniffing out that France has all this potential, but to realize that potential, it does need leadership. And they're throwing out, however weird he is, the guy who is actually trying to make both France work and the European Union work. But he also did it himself. Like he didn't sort of have to move in this direction. Closing thoughts. What are you watching for over the next couple of weeks?
Well, the first thing I'll be watching is the debate, which is happening this evening. There's a second one happening, I think it's later this week as well. That'll give the French people a more definitive view of the programs of the three leading parties. So we'll be seeing a representative we'll be seeing Gabriel Attal sit down with Jordan Bardella and a representative of the NFP. I'm not entirely certain whom. There's been a few trade-offs, but that'll be a good point of clarification. What I'll be looking at specifically in this debate is their economic programs, whether any concessions have been made for fiscal reality. I suspect there will be, and that should already, for those who are concerned by French finances, that'll already be a point of reassurance to some degree. After that, obviously, it'll be the elections themselves and the second round of the elections, where we will really see what ends up going on. And of course, I will be watching to see whether the left coalition will be able to hold together. There's been a lot of infighting, so we're not entirely certain that's going to happen. And more importantly, even whether Jordan Bardella, so the potential prime minister from the Rassemblement National, whether he's willing to accept a coalition government, which for the time being he has said he wasn't. If that changes, that really will be a game changer.
All right. Well, I hope that you'll come back on if we get any game changers. In the meantime, I always feel this way when Rob gets off the podcast. Like I have to go do my work day, and like you're ready to go to the fromagerie and get a baguette or something like that. So enjoy yourself, and I'm jealous. And hopefully we can do it in person sometime soon.
And I'll grab a camembert for you.
Oh, lovely. Thanks. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.